My colleague Peter DeMarco from the State Records Office can't be here at the moment, but he is receiving due credit for the work that he's put into this document as well, so just bear that in mind, please. This is a story about two men and a physical object, and that physical object in this case here is the Darling Range. In June 1829, when the British arrived to the place that a lot of them referred to as the land of flowing with milk and honey, this is the Swan Coastal Plain, they recognised that instead of it being a place where they could do their growing of various English crops, British crops, they couldn't really do well at all because it was just mostly sand. Now, as Western Australians, doesn't matter if you're at the Swan Coastal Plain or around here, you know that everything's sandy. So to find good soil, the British had to do something. Stirling, of course, was in charge, and he's basing a lot of his comments for the establishment of the Swan River colony, which, of course, in 1830 eventually includes Albany. As it's been discussed already, this place was originally linked to New South Wales. But by 1827, he does his survey. He does his survey in the Swan Valley, which is one of the few places where you do have good soils, but he thought it applied to the entirety of the Swan Coastal Plain. It didn't. Which, of course, we all know as Western Australians, but the British, bringing their various types of styles of agriculture, their subsistence practices, didn't know, and that caused immediate stress for the British. Western Australia is the first free settlement of Australia, the Australian continent, which is one of the reasons why Albany had to be under Swan River's jurisdiction, because at the time it was still a convict settlement. Therefore, part of the establishment of Western Australia, Swan River colony, was that it was to be convict free. So everybody here, literally in Albany, had to leave. So Barker and others went back to New South Wales. Barker didn't unfortunately make it, unfortunately. But the point is the fact that for the colony of the Swan River to survive, it needed to find better soil and so forth. So very, very quickly, you have various explorers, even though they don't really go into the category of explorers, people like Preston, Erskine, and an already mentioned at this conference, Dale, go looking for decent soil. They head mostly east, even though some of them do go south. They find some soil, in some cases, around what we refer to today as Bunbury. That's where you get the Preston River from. Dale, of course, goes over the Darling Range, and he finds good soil in a river that at the time when he encounters it with his group is flowing in a north-westerly direction. He calls it the Avon, not the Avon River, it's a tautology, the Avon. It has a different name to the Swan River which it flows into, because he didn't realise that it was actually the same river. It was flowing in a different direction. So today we have that strange linguistic complication of having the same river with two names, but when they found the Swan River, of course, it was flowing one way, and when they found the Avon, it was going another way, not realising it does a great big huge hairpin and runs into each other. So Dale finds good soil in a place that we now refer to as the Avon Valley, and all the towns that come from that site, or that exploration, come about because of the fact that that is where there's decent soil. And that would allow the Swan River colony to survive and be self-supporting, obviously. The issue with all this, which was a problem for a long time in Western Australia's history, is that it divides the actual settlement. Not only was the soil very, very poor on the Swan Coastal Plain, the British encountered for the first time, because they don't grow in New South Wales, for the first time poison plants. So the British system of mixed farming, animals, plants, and the seasons are mixed up so that you can fertilise the ground at different seasons, etc., was completely changed up because of things that they hadn't expected to encounter. But Dale finds good soil in the Avon Valley. The issue, of course, was the Darling Range. That was between now, if you divide your group of settlers from one place and put another group of settlers in places that we call York and Beverley and 2J today, straight away there's a transport issue, but that transport issue is exacerbated by the Darling Range in this case, the Darling Scarp, who was, by the way, the Governor of New South Wales when this town was established in 1826. So he does get a Guernsey in a number of places. He, Darling that is, didn't like the French, and therefore the fear of this place being occupied by the French, when I say this place, the entire western portion of New Holland, or New Holland in general, was the reasons why the British were here in Christmas Day 1826. So in 1829, 1830, it was realised that these areas of the Avon Valley had to be established because of the soil. It means that you've got a small colony now starting to spread out, but you've got the Darling Range in between. Now the Darling Range, it's not really a range. I mean, that's the best photograph I can get of actually having something that looks like a range, even though, you know, the highest point is about 586 metres. That's Mount Cook. Nobody calls it, you know, a range technically. But for the Western Australians at the time, this physical feature was like the Himalayas. It was very, very hard because of the failure of the colony, and the failure comes about because of the fact that news got back to Britain very, very quickly that this place is not the best to go to, and therefore very few people went to it. Therefore we have a situation where the early group that arrived in 1829, 1830 almost made up the core of Western Australia's population, European population, right through to 1850. But it never got bigger than, say, probably a crowd of people at this football ground at a good day. 2,000, 3,000 people, that's it. And this is going to be a British colony, obviously. So the Darling Range, a major problem, even though it's not particularly high, it still required infrastructure, it required engineering and so forth, and experience to actually make a viable route between the two places, the Swan Coastal Plain and also the agricultural areas that we will eventually refer to as York. But without people and those types of things, nobody could achieve it for a while. So this story is about one of the many attempts to put in place a decent transport route between the Swan Coastal Plain and the agricultural areas of the early Swan River colony. It talks about two people, Philip Chauncy, a surveyor, and Yoytegwert, a Noongar man who worked with this man in this survey. I'm going to introduce the characters because for many years, you look at any map, for example, of the Darling Range, and there are Indigenous names, Noongar names everywhere. And for a long time, people were unaware about or didn't know where these names came from. They thought it was coming from Philip Chauncy, who was the surveyor associated with this survey of the Darling Range, but obviously he must be speaking with people that he encounters. Well, now, because of good research occurring in the State Records Office from Peter DeMarco, we can now start putting names to these people. Yoytegwert is his Indigenous name. Now you go to Hallam and McBride in regards to Indigenous names, and they'll have this man in the dictionary, Western Australians, for Indigenous Noongar people. They also call him Darjan as a name, not realising that that is actually not his name. That's actually a corruption of the European name that was given to him, which is the Sergeant. Darjan, Sergeant, sort of sounds the same. But his Indigenous name there, as you can see, is Yoytegwert. He was a Balladong Noongar, grew up in an area which comes probably pretty close to halfway between Guildford and York, so he's in the Darling Range. This man here we know little about, and that's pretty typical of Noongar people from this historical period that we're talking about. The historical record, I've already talked about the historical record and what it does and what it doesn't do. If you keep your nose clean, it doesn't matter what culture you're from, you very rarely make an imprint into the historical record. So if you're just an ordinary person, pay your taxes, do this, do that. But if you're a criminal, the State Records Office is chock-a-block full of things associated with people doing something wrong because there has to be a paper trail. That's our culture, that's the way we do things. Now, Indigenous people, this man here, this Balladong Noongar man, Yoytegwert, was associated apparently with an event that occurred in 1839. He wasn't charged with any type of offence, despite the fact that that should be Mary Cook too, by the way, not Mark Cook. A woman and her child was killed by Noongar people in 1839, not far from York. A lot of people were rounded up, Indigenous people, questioned. Yoytegwert was one of those people, but he was never actually formally charged with anything. But that incident is one of the few things that allowed us to actually know that this man even existed. He was questioned, put in jail for a little time, hopefully to give information about who actually did commit the crime, but we don't know very much about him at all. Which is unfortunate because many of the names that we talk about, which I'll be speaking to you about in this lecture, of course, in this talk, comes probably from this man's knowledge of his area. Yeah, we don't know much about him at all. The other person we know a fair bit about, this is Philip Chauncy. Yeah, as I was saying to Sarah Murphy just before this, I do have an interest in this chap as a person. Difficult to actually interpret, and you're trying very hard to work out a person's personality by reading about them. But this man here was British, originally comes to South Australia in 1839, then comes to the Swan River Colony, Western Australia by that time, which includes Albany, in 1840. He brings with him his wife, Charlotte. His work as a surveyor is quite extensive. He's working with other people in the colonial surveying department, like Rowe, who is his boss, the Gregory brothers, who are names that are associated with the surveying of Western Australia at the time. Early days for the forests, but they're around as well. This man surveys the Swan District, all the way from Guildford, actually technically from Maylands, all the way up to where the Swan River comes out of the Darling Range. He does roads to the east, he does the towns of York, Fremantle, Gin Gin, and remarkably in this slide I forgot to mention also that he surveyed Albany in 1851. Many of the plots around here, many of the road boundaries and so forth come about because of this man surveying in this town and further north. He was here for about 18 months doing his surveying jobs. Like I said, he's an interesting person. A lot of people didn't like him, including J.S. Rowe, who made didn't make a few complaints about him. This is Rowe saying, look, you're not doing this properly. You've got to look after your horses a bit better, because the transport was so important. Chauncy didn't like Hillman particularly well. Alf Hillman, of course, was another surveyor who also surveyed Albany in 1836. But Chauncy, just through his very, very brief notes and what people are talking about him to others, you get the impression he was very, very short-tempered, didn't handle fools particularly well. There's a funny, not if you're the actual British soldiers working with him, when he was in Albany, he would get soldiers from the garrison down the bottom of the park there, not very far away from the railway line, and he would use them as chainmen, in other words, assistants for the survey. They would make a complaint back to their sergeant at the barracks saying, this guy works us too hard. You know, these men are soldiers. Just working 8 hours a day was just too much for him. But Chauncy was apparently up at 5 o'clock expecting everybody else to be up as well. So he drew, or he pushed, a fairly difficult envelope for many people, to the extent that I think in 1851, 1852, when he left the colony, some people were glad to see him go. He went to Victoria. Victoria was only around about 8 months old when he actually got there, broken away from New South Wales. But he's another man that is important for this story that I'm telling you about this survey. He is the surveyor that marked out a new road through the Darling Range and worked with Yoytegwert in this case. Now the road itself, we talked about the Silk Roads in the previous talk, and the Silk Roads are plural, of course. There's not just one Silk Road. You can apply that analogy without no doubt about it, in the fact that there were many roads to York between 1830 and probably around about the turn of the 20th century, so therefore probably around about 1905, when you had the road now which is similar to the Great Eastern Highway, what we call it. Because of the lack of resources and so forth that existed in the colony, this is all pre-convict of course, before 1850, many people who were trying to work out the best route to go from the coastal plain up to York so that therefore they could bring sources and resources backwards and forwards. Many people had tried, and therefore you had many York roads, many. Some of them still exist, some of them still hold an official line, some of them have been gobbled up by the John Forrest National Park, some of them are actually still tracks but actually now a national park. But Chauncy was one of these people again tasked in 1845-46 with finding a better road. Hopefully this man would find the best one. His brief was fairly straightforward, as you can see there. Least grade, near water, and of the lowest cost. And I think in many ways two of those ones probably still apply today, especially of the lowest cost. Western Australia was well and truly broke at the time, so everything was very much associated with keeping things as cheap as possible. Chauncy prepared for the actual survey. He lived in West Guildford, which of course is now called Bassendean. He had a house there, and therefore he lived in the Swan district, took the ferry across to Guildford a few times, and there he met Yoytegwert. And this man is kind of out of his place in regards to the areas where he should be living. Guildford is not a part of the Balladong Noongar area. It's Wajak Noongar, of course. Now, we don't know much about this man, as I said. So therefore, by marriage or by bloodlines, he might be fine to actually be there. But it also might be the fact that by 1845-46, Noongar rules and regulations in regards to kinship systems and so forth had already been severely eroded by the British, and probably already had. So therefore you've got people who shouldn't be in places like Guildford, like Yoytegwert in this case here. He's a Balladong man, but he's in Guildford, which is not Balladong land. Chauncy speaks to him. He details this is Chauncy in a letter to J.S. Rowe, saying, look, there's a man middle-aged, which is for 1845 very, very hard to work out, because what's middle age for 1845? He could be 25, I don't know. But he said he was middle-aged from the area where Chauncy is going to be doing the survey, and therefore I suggest we get him for $1 a day. But we have to pay him $1 a day because all these Noongar men are getting a lot of work in Guildford. Therefore, to attract him away, we've got to actually put up a little bit of coin in regards to it. So the contract was made. Yoytegwert and Chauncy and 2 other Europeans started doing the survey of the York Road. Now, the historical record that is produced, Yoytegwert produces no written documents at all. Everything that we have comes from the pen of Chauncy. But what we have also, you've got to consider in regards to the story that can be told. The field books, for example, are surveyors' field books. They're actually almost like a manual to produce a map. They're not the place where you're going to be talking about day-to-day events. Then you've got the letters from the surveyor to the Surveyor General. Very brief, very dry. Again, not the place where you're going to be talking about problems necessarily and so forth. Even though one thing that has occurred over the years is that these documents, many of them, at least the surveyor's field books, have been scanned. They can be a little bit difficult to actually interpret. Everything's handwritten, of course, and these documents, by the way, or these books, folded over, is only about that big. So we're talking about a very, very small thing. It was deliberately made small so it would fit into the back of the surveyor's pocket. But there's information there which you can kind of give an idea. This is page number 1 of the survey. He starts from Guildford. You can see Guildford mentioned at the top there, to York. He starts at a place which today you can still go and stand there by the corner of this fence, which is actually still the plot associated with the start of the road from Guildford all the way to York. And from those points there, he's measuring things off. He doesn't have Yoytegwert with him at this time. He's just starting with 2 chainers, and they move in an easterly direction towards the foothills. Midland doesn't exist at that time. Nothing exists, in fact, from Guildford to the foothills. Today you've got Midland or Woodbridge, Midland, Bellevue, other places. Towns which were formed after the arrival of the railways. They're all railway towns, sort of, especially Midland. This case here, this is the type of documents that you have. Therefore, you have limited information about the interaction between people because they're not there for that purpose. But you do see Yoytegwert's input into the actual historical record. Chauncy is unusual because he had an interest in Indigenous cultures. Anthropology as a discipline didn't exist in 1845. And yet, despite the fact that he did produce documents that were there to actually have a road produced or whatever it might be, he did include occasionally more personal things, including, and usually, information associated with Indigenous groups. Like that page there. This is I know we're supposed to be taping this, aren't we? So is this being taped or is that next door?
I believe this one's being taped.
Okay, well I'll just have to speak up. I've got a bit of a booming voice anyway, so because I have to stand here. I'm not really much of a person to be shackled to a podium anyway. So you can see these things here. Natives' names for various places, like Mount Dale. A well 2.5 on the York side of the halfway house, which is a structure or a site which is still there, even though now it's on private property. It's interesting that most of these places that is referred to by Chauncy in his cover of his field book are associated with water. Which, remember, that is one thing which is so important, one of the briefs, in that it had to be cheap, it had to be of least grade, but also had to be near water. And even today, if we put in a road, for example, not very long after, there'll be a service station there. That's almost the same type of thing. But in these days, in many ways, you can see Yoytegwert's input into these names, and when you go and have a look at the map at these sites here, the water source is a tiny, and Chauncy will write it on the map, a tiny hole in a rock. Chauncy wouldn't have found that. In fact, he didn't find that. It's this man's input into saying, oh, there's water over there, or there's water here, or there's a creek here, and so forth. The input of Yoytegwert into this survey is through this man's recording, the words there that he's got down. And that's very, very important to realise. It's not just from a group of people. It's not Chauncy just coming across people. It's actually a man being paid by the survey department to actually assist in the survey of this place because it's going through his homeland. There's another page there. That's the again a name for a place just to the east of Halfway House. Chauncy also had a habit of actually putting in little or small drawings as well of the topography. That's Mount Dale there, but of course, as I've said to you, you've got a situation where a lot of these places are given indigenous names as well. Now we know who is actually putting these names in to this actual map, which is still a part of our vernacular today. There's a map that I've drawn, and it gives you some idea of all these names through here, and also down the Avon towards Beverley and places like that. Chauncy's field books include not just the York Road going out to York, but also a little bit to the south as well. All these names here are coming from Yoytegwert. All of these names. Bilgoman, for example, which is one that's still there, of course, as a place name. There's a swimming pool nearby, which is ironically appropriate. And all these other places as well are associated with indigenous names for these areas. Most of them, like I said to you, are associated with water, which Chauncy didn't find. You can see how his survey, for example, goes off on different angles because he's going to where there is potable water, which in some cases would have been very, very difficult to find. Chauncy himself says, I wouldn't have been able to find this information if it wasn't for this man who we're working with, who knows the land. It would have taken me a long time. And even though he never says it, it might have been a little bit dangerous because even though it's the Darling Range, there's a few bits of water, standing water, that can be found. Most of it is associated with Aboriginal people's behaviour, putting in nammer holes and so forth. Chauncy also talks about other things that Yoytegwert did. He had this habit, like I said, of finding water, but we're not talking about creeks and streams. We're talking about nammer holes, often covered with a cap as well, which would have been for a European impossible to see unless you knew that they were there. So these objects are very, very important, and they are recorded both in the field books as names, but also appear on maps as well, because travellers were going to be using these things to go from the York area, for example, down to Guildford. He was also used, because of the fact that the Darling Range has, forest, woodland, you can't necessarily see a benchmark unless you know where to look. This man also provided Chauncy and his European surveyors, or his chainmen, with an idea about where things are, where to go to actually see benchmarks. That drawing that I showed you just a couple of slides beforehand, that one there, that comes about because they know where to go, where they can see Mount Dale off to the south, where they take a recording and so forth. Now, in this area where we are at the moment, we have wonderful stories of Colley and Barker and Macari forming relationships between different cultures, especially Colley and Macari. There's friendship there. The question you've got to ask in this case here is this man, Yoytegwert, Balladong Noongar, working with Philip Chauncy, is a similar sort of relationship forming in this case? I'd like to say yes, but Chauncy's final report to J.S. Rose says, look, this man has done wonderful work. I can't remember his native name. So, and that's the reasons why he's referred to as the sergeant or Darjan, which was his also a European name of corruption of sergeant. So it's unlikely that they form the same type of bond, and I don't know whether that's to do with Chauncy's not necessarily liking too many people anyway, or whether it's just the fact that, again, you've got a situation where Indigenous voices don't come through particularly well, nor the relationship that they build, unless you've got a very good writer, like, say, for example, Burke or someone like that was. I'll leave it there. Are there any questions, please?
Yeah, I'm just interested if you track down the etymology or the significance of the place names, along the Indigenous place names.
What I should have said is that this is still very much a work in progress. And that is one of the things, is trying to work out what these names actually mean. Despite the fact, like I said, they're associated with water, we don't know what their actual names refer to. It is all, as you could imagine, phonetic as well, which makes translation difficult. But that's where the actual the work is continuing, speaking to Noongars in the area and trying to get some sort of an idea. I mean, Noongar, of course, is a language all the way down here as well, of course. There is crossover, and even in Chauncy, when he's surveying down here, he has a list of Noongar names, and you can see the names are linked back also to the same language that you have back in Perth. But no, that is where we're also moving to.
I'm aware of Ross Chadwick's work and Bill Bowden on the Noongar word list.
Yes.
So there's the 1992 publication of that.
That's right.
Are there sort of correspondences that you can detect through these sorts of things? Is there a kind of like an archaeology of the language?
There is, but again, those are the types of people we need to be speaking to. It's interesting because there aren't necessarily some words which you'd expect, say, for hill. I mean, Mount Dale, for example, I don't think that actually is something hill. I think there's something else there, because you don't necessarily have those words, Noongar words, associated with those features. But that's going to be an exciting thing to see what was actually going on. We might find, and this would be a nice historical twist, that all of these names have got nothing to do with landmarks. It's just Yoytegwert having a bit of a go at Chauncy, calling him all sorts of things. Wouldn't be the first time that a European's had the wool pulled over their eyes in that case. So, but that again would be another story in itself, of course.
I will say, just on that topic, being Indigenous and working with a lot of Noongar artists and fluent Noongar speakers, it's a really difficult thing to figure out if you're saying the right thing, even when you're talking to someone who feels very confident. So my main line of work is I do acting and singing. I was working with the West Australian Opera recently in one of their shows, and the show is entirely in Noongar language. There's the speaker. The show is entirely in Noongar language, and you have to go through 3 or 4 people to make sure you're getting the right translation, and that's with all of those people. Everyone in the room is Indigenous, and we're all asking each other, "Are you sure about this?" And because my nan told me it was this, and my nan told me it was this, and not arguments in an angry way, but it's consistently evolving as to what the popular belief is of each word. So I think that also will take time from just that standpoint. Any questions? Yeah, there was that.
Is there any record of Chauncy using a local Menang person when he was down here?
Yes, his name was Skinfleet. Now, that is obviously not his Indigenous name. But he does appear again in the dictionary of, in this case here, Noongar people of the Albany area. I think it was Lois Tilbrook that put that together. But yes, but we don't know what his Indigenous name was. It was actually a European name.
Yes. Should give you the microphone.
And another thing which I learned in my research also, there was one Sikh gentleman around Wandering and Beverly area. His name was Veer Singh. with the letter V, but his indigenous descendants refer to him as Beer Singh. So they do not produce the sound V, they produce V becomes B.
Yes.
So that's another thing we have to keep in mind also.
That's right. We would have noticed that some of those names there had the GN or the NG, a bit like Nangara, for example, which is still around, of course. That's actually not a bad effort in getting some of the pronunciation right, but at least we've got 2 letters out of many. So where does the rest of it go?
It's even with the NG sounds. Gina Williams is, I don't know if any of you guys know Gina Williams.
Yeah.
So, of course, she wrote the opera that I was a part of, and that NG sound is the death of anyone who is trying to speak it in the first place, because it's all in the back of the tongue. And as English speakers, everything's so forward, consistently. But if I'm saying, so like, the way she does it goes, say sing onions and then cut out the middle and see if you can get that. It's like, nah. It just, after a while, and people hear it as a NY 90% of the time. But she'll slap me on the wrist if I do that, so, Are there any more questions?
Yeah. That's a fascinating story because it sort of ties the link between the Swan River colony and the Avon Valley and particularly Guildford. So, what happened? 2 questions. What happened to Chauncy at the end of the day? And secondly, how important and critical was the agricultural development of the Swan Valley around Guildford and York to the fate of the colony in future years? How critical was it?
We don't have enough time to reply to that, I'm afraid. No, seriously though, the Swan Valley was super essential to the extent that when the convicts arrived, even though it was the agriculturalists in York and 2J that wanted the convicts, very few people actually wanted them to come in. Interestingly, the first place they went to was the Swan Valley, not to York or 2J. So the Swan Valley was still very, very important for agricultural reasons. It was probably closer to Perth and overcame these transport problems that we're talking about. The river, that's right, it was a highway. Sorry, what was the other comment that you made? Oh, about what happened to Chauncy.
What happened to Chauncy?
Chauncy eventually finished up in Victoria and wrote books about Indigenous cultures, and he used some things from Western Australia as a comparison with what he's seeing in Victoria. The question should be what happened to Yoytegwert. We don't know.
We have to wrap it up there, guys. But one round of applause, please.